Hello and welcome to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. This week's episode sees us examine the Nordic countries for the first time, with a look at Urho Kekkonen, who served as President of Finland between 1956 and 1982. Whilst Finland was not a dictatorship during the post-war era, Kekkonen towered over the Finnish political system, creating a complex system whereby he co-opted his potential adversaries into an ever larger coalition, such that at election time, he was safe from serious political opposition. When dealing with the Finnish parliament and the country's trade unions, Kekkonen was a master negotiator, hammering out deals between different parties, namely the Social Democrats, leading to a corporate economic structure that contributed to remarkable increases in living standards in the 60s and 70s. It's easy to overlook that even in 1950, Finland was an almost totally agrarian country. In spite of his tendency to engulf everything in Finland's politics, Kekkonen's time in power has to be viewed with this economic success in mind. The most interesting element of Kekkonen, though, is that he perfectly summarises his country's difficult relationship with its eastern neighbour, Russia, or as it was in Kekkonen's time, the Soviet Union. Early on in his political career, Kekkonen decided that, faced with a much larger, much stronger neighbour, Finland's best hope of survival was to give the Soviet Union just enough control over Finland, such that the Soviets wouldn't lose their temper with them. As you're about to hear, this had mixed results, but succeeded in its principal aim of maintaining Finland's de facto independence. The country remained a market economy, and avoided the fate of countries like Czechoslovakia and Hungary, both of which, among others, disappeared behind the Iron Curtain. Indeed, Kekkonen was close personal friends with Leonid Brezhnev, who I covered 2 weeks ago, and my guest today points out that Finland cannot have a bad relationship with Russia. Their proximity to each other makes this utterly out of the question. This fact is something that is giving the Finns a serious headache now that Europe is once again turning its back on the Russians. My guest today is Finnish historian Henrik Meinander, who is a professor at the University of Helsinki. Henrik's English language book, A History of Finland, was released in 2011 and updated in 2019. As well as discussing Kekkonen's life and politics, I asked Henrik what he thought of Finland joining NATO, and whether he really thought the Finns are the happiest people in the world, as they're often designated. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Urho Kekkonen. Hi Henrik, how are you?
Fine. How are you? Thanks.
I'm very well. I have to say, you win the prize. I've done nearly 40 of these episodes and you win the prize for the best backdrop of recording. You're by a lake in somewhere in rural Finland, and it's magnificent.
Yes, I'm beginning my summer holiday. In Finland, we have our summer holiday in July, not in August, and so because in August, autumn is arriving almost. So we
yes,
have it in July.
That's a good idea. I think somebody should recommend that to our government. We're talking about Urho Kekkonen today, Henrik. He's often referred to as by his initials UKK, and he was the president of Finland between 1956 and 1982. So he has a longevity in politics that rivals other politicians I've focused on in this podcast series. Eamon de Valera in Ireland, Salazar in Portugal. He was born in 1900. What was life like as a young man for Urho Kekkonen in the Finland of the sort of early part of the 20th century? Finland's obviously different from other Nordic countries in the sense that it's been independent for much less time.
Yes, Finland was a part of the Russian Empire as a Grand Duchy, had been such since the Napoleonic Wars, when Finland was ripped off the Swedish kingdom and joined to Russia. Urho Kekkonen came from the northern half of Finland, from also the Lake District, from rather humble backgrounds, but one could say somewhere between working class and lower middle class. So he was sent to secondary school and took A grades from there. He became a energetic nationalist already during his school years, and began to write in the local newspaper, and joined then the White Guards when the Russian Revolution spread to Finland in late January 1918. And then he was not even 18 years old. He had his birthday in the 3rd of September. So his first visit to Helsinki was when he took part in the victorious parade in Helsinki, the 16th of May 1918. That is to say, when the White Guards then arrived to Helsinki. Now, actually, it was the German troops that had taken over the control in southern Finland. It was in Finland we have usually call it a civil war, but it was an integrated part of the Russian civil war and revolution. But the Bolsheviks, then demanded that the Finnish Social Democrats should take the power, and the Germans then also demanded that the whites would declare Finnish independence, which they did. So it was actually a part of First War. So Kekkonen then began his studies in early 20s and was an ultra-nationalist. He required that the Swedish-speaking minority in Finland and their language rights that were written in our constitution should be rewritten, and took part in demonstration against this bilingual education at our university. But then in the 30s, he began to take part in politics and was elected in the parliament in 1936. Now, you have to remember, apart from him being a journalist, he also worked for our security service. So he learned pretty much about communists and their, so to say, of thinking, as when the arrested communists were interrogated, and he took part in that. But he was also a very skillful sportsman.
He was, yes, a skillful sportsman, and I think very tall, if I'm right in saying so. Right?
Yes,
he was sort of 6'5".
Oh yes, I think so, something like that. Yes.
Although maybe for Finnish people, Finnish people, that's not that tall. I don't know.
No. It was clearly above our, average. Clearly above average, and he maintained his physical condition up until he was forced to resign in autumn 1981. Of course, he took a lot of also drinks, and that he never became an alcoholic because he maintained his condition very well. But that was something, his kind of idea, that he should maintain his physical endurance, and he was very much known for that.
I think something in the conversation that we've been having so far, something that's come up already is the relationship with the Soviet Union. Obviously, the Soviet Union was a much larger country geographically than Finland, so that, I suppose, gave it a kind of natural advantage, and perhaps gave a natural sort of inferiority and a securitization among the Finns of the Soviet Union, and a fear. If we discuss what happened in 1938, 1939, there was obviously the Finnish-Soviet War. What was Kekkonen's experience of this war? Quite a brief war, but a one that's been very important in the sort of Finnish national psyche.
Yes, it was the winter war between late November 1939 and March 1940. It was a part of early stage of Second World War. And now Finland had been a part of the Russian Empire, had then declared its independence, and fought a kind of war that was by the bourgeoisie troops described as a war against Russia, which it strictly speaking was not. But the Soviet Union, of course, tried to debalance the Finnish young democratic parliamentarism, and in the late 1930s, then Finland had got a coalition between Social Democrats and the Agrarian League, in which Kekkonen played a quite strategically important role. He became Minister of Domestic Affairs. But his attitude towards Soviet Union was really, there are different interpretations of how he saw it. Now, after the war, he often, tried to, so to say, emphasize his version of what had happened in the late 1930s by emphasizing that if Finland would have understood to find a compromise with Soviet Union, Finland could have avoided this war. Now, in late 1930s, his opinion was not really that. It was very difficult to think that Finland, for the Finnish parties to reach a compromise with Soviet Union. The Baltic states very soon reached a compromise and let the Red Army establish military bases on their territory, whereas the Finnish negotiators in fact were not prepared to give an inch over to Soviet Union. Kekkonen was understood in that situation as too, so to say, stiff in his policy. Although we have to add that he had also fought as Minister of Domestic Affairs a kind of political struggle against our fascist party. He tried to implement a law that would forbade fascist activity in Finland, but was not successful in that. So when a new government was formed, when the war had begun, he lost his minister position because he was understood as not politically, so to say, wise and really understanding what was happening.
The Finnish, I think it's fair to say really that they beat the Soviet Union in this war. And obviously then the Second World War came fairly shortly after. Once that conflict had come to an end, what sort of position did that leave Kekkonen in as a politician for the post-war period?
I think you remember that the Winter War was a part of already Second World War because Poland had been divided between Soviet Union and Germany, and the war between the Western countries, powers and Germany had begun already then. So it was really a kind of, during the first winter in Second World War, actually the most fierce fights were actually fought in Finland and then on the Balkans. But Kekkonen had in a way lost much of his political credibility due to what happened. He remained a member of the parliament, but would not, be named to the new government that was formed then after the peace treaty was signed with Soviet Union. He had actually demanded that the fight would continue. The reason being that the Soviet army was strongly motorized, and in Finnish harsh conditions, when the transport ways freezing period is over, they are very difficult to advance along. So that was the idea, that the Finns should continue their fight, and that even more made Kekkonen look like a too radical and unrealistic political figure. And that would actually continue up until 1943. He was active columnist in our political weekly Suomen Kuvalehti. And in the beginning of the war, 1941 to 1944, when Finland was a German ally, because the Finnish state leadership had come to the conclusion that after both the Baltic states had been occupied by Soviet Union and Denmark and Norway by Germany and Sweden, and Finland could not, neither Germany or Soviet Union allowed Finland and Sweden to join a sort of state union. So what kind of realistic option was left if you didn't want to be occupied by Red Army? So that was an ally with Germany, and that actually then took place and was very systematic up until the bitter end in autumn 44. Kekkonen was very much in favor of this alliance. wrote enthusiastically about this. The idea was that when Germany had crushed Soviet Union, Finland would gain back the territory that it had lost in the Winter War and gain even more, large territories in eastern Karelia. This was something that was inspiring and for an ultranationalist as Kekkonen was, the Finnish, so to say, nationalistic ideology included very much the idea that East Karelia was kind of the heartland of the Finnish civilization, which was clearly mythology. But then in 1943 he changed his mind when he understood that Germany was going to lose the war, and Kekkonen's kind of real political thinking became stronger, and he began to prepare already for this kind of change in politics that then took place in 1944.
That change obviously ultimately being the sort of the grinding defeat of Nazi Germany. If we look at Finland in the post-45 era, you mentioned the agrarian party that later became obviously the Centre Party in Finland. To kind of bring it forward to when Kekkonen is president, Kekkonen became president eventually in 1956. How powerful was the agrarian party after 1945 until the point where Kekkonen becomes president, and what sort of role is he playing in government during that time?
It was one of the big parties. We had, the biggest party was then, as up until 1990s, the Social Democratic Party. And in 1944, the Communist Party became also legalized again. So it was the Agrarian Party, Social Democratic Agrarian League, and Social Democratic Party and Communists that were three big parties in 1945. Actually, the Communists got 1/4 of all the votes in 1945. A kind of shock for many non-socialists. But that was rather typical in different parts of Europe. Think only about what happened in Great Britain, where the Labour won and the election, even if the Churchill had been the prime minister up until then. But Kekkonen was able to establish from the beginning, working in a relationship with KGB, NKDV, that later became the KGB, through the agents, and through that also to Zhdanov and Moscow. So when Finland in 1948, then 1947 was signed a peace treaty with victors in Second World War. That was about the same, included the same, so to say, things that in the Armistice Treaty in 1944. But 1948, Finland and Soviet Union signed a treaty of the long name of the treaty, but its actual, so to say, function was that Finland was obliged to defend its territory against attacks that were directed towards Soviet Union through Finnish territory. It was not an open military alliance, but it had kind of military, one could say, consequences if a kind of great power war would break out again. Kekkonen was actually, then Paasikivi had advanced, he became 1946 president, and Kekkonen was one of his closest advisors when this treaty was designed under very, so to say, nervous conditions, because in spring 1948, a coup d'etat had happened in Czechoslovakia, and many thought that this was going to happen also in Finland. And many in Western Europe thought that it would be the end of the Finnish independence. It did not happen, but it also lay then ground for a kind of Finnish-Soviet relationship that in the long run would become problematic.
Well, this is what I want to come on to, because Kekkonen, I think, is remembered for sort of orchestrating a policy which has been called neutrality in the wider Cold War between the Americans and the Soviet Union. As you've just said, this wasn't really his policy exactly, because it predated when he became president eventually in 1956. But do you think that that's a fair word to describe Finland's role in the Cold War? neutral?
Not really.
Because obviously the situation that you've just described about the Finns sort of taking part in a war
Yes.
in which the Soviet Union would also be involved can't really be described as neutral.
Finland was neither neutral during the war nor after the war, because this treaty with the Soviet Union that was signed in 1948 included such obligations that really, among Western commentators and politicians, really was understood as that Finland, in one way or another, was included in the Soviet interest sphere. Although Finland was not, the Finnish political system was not socialist, we maintained our parliamentarian democracy. But it was kind of claim in the treaty. It is from 1948. It is expressed that Finland's attempt was to maintain or keep a distance to conflicts that would arise between the great powers. That was, so to say, aim. It was not expressed in that treaty that Finland was a neutral country. But then during Kekkonen's presidential era, this kind of interpretation of this treaty was emphasized more and more. A so-called active neutrality policy. It was a kind of way to follow the Swedish, so to say, rhetoric. In Sweden, it was emphasized that Sweden had a military non-allied neutrality policy, whereas in fact, as we know, Sweden, pretty soon after NATO was established, began to cooperate with NATO. And Finland again was outside of this sphere. So it was, as many other things during the Cold War, things were not expressed with the right name. But then, of course, it was not. The Western countries had nothing to lose by in a way, officially to emphasize that they believed in Finnish neutrality.
What was people like Kekkonen's rationale for pursuing this policy? You could interpret it, I suppose, as kind of walking a tightrope between East and West.
Yes, you could do it. One could. I sometimes express it like that. The Finns, we got the kind of trauma from Winter War when Finland was left to fight a war in practice alone. Now, since then, the Finnish foreign policy has always built on this experience that the Finns should remember that no one will come and help us if the question is only about Finnish independence, because NATO was an alliance that did not include Finland, and the Great Britain and America had in fact then accepted the Soviet dominance in the Baltic area. Finland was left to cope on its own, and this was actually the sort of hard base for this policy. That always you should always take in count this unfortunate possibility that Finland would be left alone, and how should you then cope with Soviet Union? Then, of course, there was also selfish motives for we're talking about Kekkonen. He wanted to become the next president in 1956, and his way to handle also the relationship with Soviet Union was clearly also colored by this. His so to say personal motives were combined with the idea that Finland had to cope with Soviet Union. You have to also remember the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 60s was understood as a kind of dynamic superpower. And some people thought that, especially after Khrushchev had reached power, that Soviet Union could maybe overtake or become stronger than United States. His biographer, Juhani Suomi, claims that actually that is what Kekkonen feared. that was of course not, he was not a socialist, and as I said, he had been a fierce nationalist. This was probably his ideas in early 1960s. At the same time, Soviet Union and the Finnish communists, helped him to power. And
so he wanted, I think, he wanted to try and kind of take the sting out of the possible relationship with the Soviet Union, right? He wanted to keep this peaceful and to try and basically keep Finland as an independent country, even if it was independent in a kind of vassal state form, right?
Yes, if you put it so rudely, but it pretty much was the case. Of course, it was a way also to rob the so to say special relationship that our communists had towards Moscow. That if you are able to establish direct contacts with the Soviet Communist Party, then Moscow would not need our domestic communists to have an impact on what happened in Finland. So you clearly see that Kekkonen had also this idea, and actually it was the same idea that our social democrats then would apply from mid-1960s onwards, and have just finished a biography of a long-time Finnish Prime Minister Kalevi Sorsa, in which I described that this was actually Kekkonen's, so to say, strategy was taken over by all the possible parties of government. And so it is for Kekkonen's. It was also Kekkonen's good relationships with Moscow that made it possible for Finland to then sign a kind of treaty with EFTA in 1960 and with EEC 1973.
I want to come on to his sort of relationship with the West rather than the East later. First, I just want to try and look at his political career a bit more closely. You've mentioned two different roles in the last answer: the presidency and the premier, and the president and the prime minister. Kekkonen, as I've said a couple of times, became president in 1956. What was the role of the president in that era? Because I know that it's sort of shifted over time, perhaps due to Kekkonen in part. But how powerful was the presidency when Kekkonen was occupying that role?
It was pretty powerful because our constitution that had been in use since 1990 gave the president, he was sovereign when in question of foreign policy, but he was also so kind of central person in question of how to form the government, and he had the right to dissolve the parliament. Kekkonen used this kind of weapon at least 3 times during his 25 years as president, and each time he did not because it was a real political crisis, but because it was something that favored or strengthened his position in politics. So that was why, if you compare the Finnish constitution with, you can compare it in a way to the French constitution during de Gaulle, and that meant that really all the parties that wanted to maximize their societal impact wanted, of course, to have their own man in as president, even if the president would leave over his party member book after he had been elected. This connection would remain. We haven't had a president that hasn't, so to say, maintained kind of a certain political dependency or impact on its own party. So that's why the presidency was really crucial in Finnish politics up until the year of 2000, when we got a new constitution in which president was ripped off all his domestic power, and that was very much because of the experience of what had happened during Kekkonen's era.
Well, let's drill down into that experience a bit more then. I've seen Kekkonen described as being autocratic You mentioned his sort of attempts to kind of crush parliamentary opposition to him. How did this kind of manifest itself at election times? Imagine if, so Kekkonen is standing to be president at an election in Finland. Some of the tactics that we might think of autocrats now or contemporaries of Kekkonen's would be things like intimidation of hostile press, attempts to sort of shut down political debates, shut down political parties. What tactics did Kekkonen use?
Now, he didn't go so far as, let us say, some of the autocrats today. That was not a way of to direct or censor, the political opposition. But he could, through different means, then hinder that the Conservative Party and the Populist Party. We got the Populist Party in our parliament in 1917. That was led by a man who hated Kekkonen, to put it shortly. He had been, member of the same party as Kekkonen, had been in close, cooperation with him. But then the skis were, so to say, crossed, as we say in Finland. So he was able to, guarantee that after there was a crisis in 1961, when those parties who really didn't like that Kekkonen had become president in 1956 tried to, they then found, a common candidate for the presidency, and Kekkonen then was able to. It is also very much debated how much had Kekkonen role in that in autumn 1961. So the government Soviet Union sent a note demand to the Finnish government in which it suggests that military consultations would now start, and they then mentioned the Berlin crisis and what happened in West Germany, but in fact it was a way to reassure that Kekkonen would be re-elected. Now, since then, Kekkonen could each time when the elections had been arranged, he would then stop that any party that was against him would join the government. And when that was established, it maintained it. That was the, so to say, political rule up until 1987, actually. 1987, when the Conservative Party had been opposition since 1966. And Social Democrats had again been also in kind of having lost in the presidential election 1956, was in a very difficult position up until 1966, when it then decided to accept Kekkonen's, so to say, rule and follow his, so to say, route in also establishing, close relationship to Moscow through KGB.
Could you, in that case, call him maybe a benevolent autocrat, a benevolent dictator, in the sense that he wasn't really enforcing his continued power through army presence on the street or kind of this sort of violent intimidation of his opponents? It was perhaps a softer form of the authoritarian rule.
I mean, you could neither talk about dictatorship or a really authoritarian rule, because it was according to our constitution. And now, even if he arranged it now, in 1973, he arranged that he didn't have to, because the presidential elections were planned to be arranged in 1974. And he said, that he could think that to continue as president, but he didn't want to, take part in elections. So in a way, then in order for the parties to maintain their, so to say, favor position in the government, they then obeyed this. It had also to do with the Kekkonen combined the question of Finnish EC treaty with the continuation of his presidency. So he was able to get, also together with a kind of support from Soviet Union to arrange it. But it would be too much to claim that he was a dictator or being that he was overruling our constitution. It was more that the so to say political culture had developed in that direction, that he was able to use that. And it actually in the 70s it was more a question of that the parties were already preparing for who would become after him, and so those who Social Democrats therefore were also accepting the idea that he would be elected through a extraordinary law in 1973 up until 1978 to avoid that center partist that was favored by Soviet Union. So that was a kind of, it was a presidential game that was going on all the time, and Kekkonen used this also game for his own purpose.
It was a negotiation then, essentially, a sort of constant negotiation with different parties. In that case, I mean, do you think that Kekkonen can really be described as having a sort of ideology? Because obviously, if you're going to be bartering with all of these different groups, domestic and foreign, all the time, you're going to have to be giving up quite a lot of ground politically to them, right? I mean, do you think he was? You've mentioned the Social Democrats, you mentioned the Conservatives. What was Kekkonen in that?
Kekkonen was in a way, according to the Social Democrats, he became more kind of social democratic minded in his late 60s and during the 70s. It is questionable if that was the case, but having his background, he was of course in favor of strengthening the equality, the social equality, and so in that sense he was pretty close to the Social Democrats. But that did not mean that he was so much. He didn't really have such strong ideas about what Parliament could reach, and he had been, he had the experience from Second World War and 1930s. So it was really more a question that he was, once he had ruled for so long time in 1970s, he really began to think that he was a man he knew better than the Parliament and the government. Now, the Finnish society developed, if we don't talk about this complicated political culture that we had in 1960s and 70s. 1960s and 70s were decades when the social mobility was higher, and so to say, and taxation, progression of taxation was stronger than ever before or later. There was a large, really, reforms that were put in practice. Our comprehension school, that is one of the few comprehension schools that still in function in Europe, was established then, and a number of very important social reforms were put in practice in 1970s. So you should ask also the question, how many Finns, apart from the parliamentarians, suffered from this? So if you talk about what was the ideology, I would say that it was still, there was of course some clear, selfish and Machiavellian motives. There was also the idea that this kind of very stable and political governance would be the best way to move ahead, because still we had a large communist party that had 1/5 of all the votes. This was his ideology, one could say.
Was he popular?
I mean, among those who voted for him, and even among those who remember what kind of opportunist he had been in 1930s and later on, they were forced to accept that this Finnish relationship with the Soviet Union was stable, and those who were, in the were in the middle age in 1970s had fought in the war, knew that it was very close that Finland would have been crushed. So this thing that we had functional, relationship with Soviet Union was a good thing, and of course, some parts of the population thought he was autocratic and used methods that were not really accepted. Finns used to use the expression Kekkosen konstit, that meant the way, Kekkonen's, so to say, manipulation, one could say, but it sounds better in Finnish. Kekkonen's art, maybe one could say, was an expression that was used. So there was our leading daily, Helsingin Sanomat, had a cartoonist that continued to draw rather, harsh and ironic, sarcastic, political cartoons of Kekkonen, even if he had become president of the republic. So in 1978, when he was the last time elected, he got a very large number of all the votes. But that was more because people all knew that would be his last, so to say, round, and so it was more a celebration of his statesmanship than a real election.
It sounds as if, although Kekkonen's presence made politics, kind of the upper echelons of politics, quite closed off and perhaps quite stilted, the actual political culture within the country remained quite strong and quite democratic. Kekkonen eventually left power in 1982. Were people glad to see him go by the time he left?
Yes. I mean, because it was so obvious that it had went much too far, his way to rule the country. And there was, when his successor was elected, Mauno Koivisto, the Social Democrat, was elected, it was the highest number of votes given in any election during the independence in Finland. Never before or after so many Finns have been taking part in the election. It was clearly a protest election in which Finns thought that we really want to leave that behind. But still, you have a number of Finns that still, celebrate the memory of his statesmanship, of course, among his party members, but also among many others, social democrats and communists and former communists and such.
When you look back at the overall effect of his policy towards the Soviet Union, of basically allowing them a certain degree of influence so long as Finland kind of retained its overall independence, or at least its superficial independence. I mean, the downside is fairly obvious there, that it very much restricts Finland's ability to kind of maneuver on its own terms. But can you see a successful side to it? In terms of perhaps being able to kind of extract advantages from the Soviet Union. Can you see any?
Yeah, I can see many. There's an ongoing debate in Finland, the so-called term Finlandization. I mean, Kekkonen was a personification of this Finlandization. That was this dark era in Finnish history, or was it, as defenders of Kekkonen claim, were these, so to say, maneuvers required in order to maintain the Finnish, so to say, political system, because when you're talking about municipality politics, it was a total different story. There was a strong coalition often in urban areas between social democrats and conservatives, and in other parts then communists were strong, and the Swedish People's Party. So it was really, I would say, at on a municipal niveau, it was pretty well functioning, but as you said, there were some problematic parts. But then it was not only Kekkonen. We had strong corporatism. The labor movement. I mean, I don't mean with that the social democrat, but the
trade union movement.
Trade union. So the trade union they were and also the export industry together was an important power structure in that. So it was not only Kekkonen that played a role in that, but altogether, I would say that there were some problematic parts of it, but that had to do with the geopolitics. I led a research program for some years ago in which we compared the Finnish and Swedish democracy and democratization during 20th century with each other. And I developed a kind of thesis that, to simplify it, in which I claim that a democratization in a country is dependent on three things. First, the political culture, which is the base. If you don't have a rule of law and trust in your compatriots, forget democracy. But if you have that, it's possible. But in order to that, it's not only a question of this domestic order, but you need to have a growth that is dependent on how the country is situated in a world economy. If you don't have a growth in a length, democracy is not possible. And that's, of course, a difficult thing to discuss when you, for the environment movement, that think that we should leave behind this growth idea. And thirdly, the third factor dimension is geopolitics. If country is threatened or it is manipulated or occupied, democracy is, of course, threatened. In the Finnish case, you can see that the neighborhood with the Soviet Union meant during the Cold War that our democracy, parliamentarian democracy, did not function as it should have functioned according to the rule. But otherwise, you can clearly see that 60s and 70s, we're talking about social development, was extraordinarily good.
Yes, I mean, Finland did become a genuine export-oriented market democracy with a certain degree of kind of social protection in there as well, which is pretty amazing considering that in 1945 it was basically an agrarian economy, right?
Very much so, yes, true.
Like way more than Germany. It was much more like France, that hadn't, in the sense that it hadn't really industrialized very much at all in the first half of the 20th century.
Yes, I mean, it was clearly more agrarian than Finland was, like the Balkan countries, and that continued because we had two large land reforms, one after First World War, another after Second World War. That really, so to say, then one could say, in one way was something that hindered social unrest, but then it also was something that hindered urbanization. So that was a situation up until 1960s when everything then very rapidly began to change, much more rapidly than the other countries. In Sweden, the industrialization, urbanization had continued since late 19th century, whereas in Finland it was much later phenomenon.
Yes, I suppose if you're looking at the reason that Kekkonen was able to stay so long, you could attribute maybe two things, two possible things. One is a kind of fundamentally positive thing, which is that he improved the state of the economy and social protection for average Finnish people. And then there's probably a more negative one, which is that he kind of lambasted political opposition and bullied people and sort of restricted democracy to stay in power. Which one do you think is more prevalent? Obviously, it's a bit of both. These things always are. But what's more important?
Tricky question. I mean, of course, it's. I cannot defend the way the political order was manipulated by him. But then, if I think about my friends and what I have seen in my life in Finnish society, there are some very important positive things that happened during his rule. But you have to remember, it was of course not only Kekkonen who did it, because it was the coalitions between the Social Democrats and the Centre Party that made it possible. So it was the Social Democratic Party has claimed in its history writing it was social democrats that achieved this, and among the liberals and center parties they claimed the opposite, of course. But it was possible because they were forced to reign together, and that has been the Finnish way to form governments. Whereas in Sweden, it has been very much so-called bloc policy, either left or right. Whereas in Finland, such governments would not have been wise, because that would have only made the relationship with Soviet Union difficult. That was why also Kekkonen tried to avoid such clear left governments. But you have to remember, we haven't had a left kind of majority in our parliament since 1970.
Yeah, I mean, politics there is very factional, such that sort of no one party rules, I guess. I want to ask you a couple of questions about Finland as it is now, sort of 30, 40 years on from the Kekkonen period. Your country is often ranked as one of the happiest in the world. And I wanted to ask, I mean, I think being born in any part of Europe really is a big stroke of luck. Being European is you're very lucky to be European, I think. But I think even by European standards, most people would say that Finland, if you're born Finnish, it's a pretty lucky place to be born, even by European standards, by the standards of the wealthiest continent, or one of the wealthiest continents on the planet. Are there any big downsides to being born in Finland, do you think? Or do you basically see it as a real blessing?
I would say this, how you measure luck, we Finns are very skeptical about this kind of all these measurements, as you probably understand, because if you meet a Finn, that would be not your first impression of that it's a lucky person. But I think it has more to do with our social structure and the concentration of wealth. Comparing with most other European countries, the concentration of wealth. Of course, we are a class society. I'm not a Marxist, but of course, everybody understands that we live all in class societies. But our class society is clearly more flatter than in Sweden. There we have, because we have so little, unfortunately, immigrants. This has also, made it possible, and due to maybe the so to say long effect of the positive development in post-war Finland, you can see also kind of feeling of that. It's a question of degree of envy or not feeling very strong envy towards your neighbors. That is what the Bible is forbidding us to feel, but it's difficult, of course, to avoid it. But and it has to do with the land reforms. But it also actually is much, historically a much longer phenomenon, because Finland was a part of Sweden. The land owned in Finland was much more owned by the peasants than on the Swedish part of the Swedish kingdom, where it was the aristocracy and the state that was owning the land. And this kind of continuing, so to say, experience, and also the regional policy in Finland during the Cold War. Because the agrarian party, of course, it was in its interest to, when they had their compromises with social democrats, to invest pretty much in regional development, universities, infrastructures, and also industry. And I think that also, improved this feeling of, I wouldn't say luck, or it's difficult.
Perhaps, I mean, unity might be the word that sort of sums up a lot of what you've discussed. There's quite an interesting book that's just been released called Free by Leia Erpi. It's about communist Albania, and she grew up in communist Albania and said that there were many downsides, very repressive system, but there was a sort of suppression of jealousy and one-upmanship. among people. People didn't feel that somebody else had more than them.
Yeah,
and actually, that made things very, very stable.
Yeah, I think I read the review of that in London Review of Literature. That was very interesting. She has become.
It's a very good book.
Yeah, so I think that's one explanation. We have some economic, structural, rather severe problems today, and that we have opposite to then, Norway is of course another story. But both Denmark and Sweden have been able to take a step forward into, so to say, world economy, and Finland is still somehow longing for an era where we could do business with Russians, and that is of course lost. Because if you look at historically when Finland has been able to develop faster than other countries, it had been Paris when the trade with Soviet Union and Russia has been lucrative and pretty important. Not dominant, but of course Europe has been all the time the most important market for Finland. But so that's what we have now to solve somehow.
I just have one more question, just 5 more minutes of your time, Henrik, if that's all right. I mean, so much of what we've discussed with Kekkonen today has revolved around Russia, and the thing that for which Finland is sort of most well known in the international media right now is, of course, that you're probably about to join NATO. I just wanted to know, I mean, after so long of this, again, I'm going to use a sort of tightrope act between East and West. How would you feel about finally kind of throwing all your chips in with NATO? Do you think that would make you feel safer?
Yes, that's what we feel. But you have to remember that when Finland joined European Union in 1995, it was in foremost a kind of question of security policy, even if it was not admitted, because when Finland applied for membership in 1992, there was a real fear that unrest in Russia would develop into civil war. And so the same year as Finland applied for EU membership, Finland bought 64 FA Hornet fighters. So the Finnish, so to say, step towards NATO began actually in 1994, directly after Soviet Union had rumbled down, and the treaty from 1948 was dissolved. So again, it was this fear, and that Finland didn't want to be left alone with this power. But the Finnish governments have, since 1995, in each government program, they have included the so-called NATO option, that if things change in European security politics, Finland maintain its, so to say, preparedness to apply for NATO membership. And step by step, the cooperation with United States and UK and also Sweden became deeper. So by now, the Finnish defense is totally synchronized, as a system with NATO forces. Actually, we have, I think, one of the few true conscription armies. So we have a kind of, it's like what you now say in Ukraine. We have had a kind of, in Ukraine they have a faster lane to this kind of feeling that they have a strong motive to do what they do when they fight their wars. And this is something that for Finns it has not been so much a question of ideology. Finns, we look forward to some in the future, reach some kind of, again, if not good, but let's hope also good relations with Russia. I mean, if you want to continue to live in Finland, you have to cope with that. It cannot remain the relationship that Finland now has with Russia eternally, and that is something that we really you can see in our media and how we discuss Russia, there's clear difference if it compare with how it's discussed in the other Scandinavian countries, where this kind of the pendulum movement is much stronger. So we avoid still to be emotional when we discuss Russia.
I think that can only be a good thing. Not being too impulsive or hot-headed about it. Henrik, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that talk. If people want to find out more about what you've written, either about Kekkonen or just about Finland more generally, where can you direct them towards?
I mean, they could read my history of Finland that was in a new edition, was published in 2019, and next year my biography of a very famous, also Finnish statesman and military strategist Mannerheim will be published in Great Britain. So that's, I mean, it sounds selfish, but that's what where I would start and look at my references.
No,
so to be so selfish.
No, you can be as self-referential as you like. That's why I asked the question. I want to get you to plug your stuff. So thank you, Henrik. Cheers.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, so you never miss new content.